SpaceX just filed for the largest IPO in recorded history. $75 billion. $2 trillion valuation. That places it ahead of Meta, ahead of Berkshire Hathaway. But this is not a bet on broadband. It is a bet on owning the orbital compute layer. And that matters for every organization that touches a satellite. Here's what the headline completely misses. 80% of SpaceX's current profit is Starlink broadband. The $75 billion finances the next layer. Orbital data centers, AI model hosting at altitude, strategic control of the launch market. And while all of that is happening, New Zealand's GBSI Stage 2 regulations were expected in April, not July. If your organization operates ground-based satellite infrastructure, your compliance window just moved forward.
Let's get into it.
Welcome to the Hamberger Report, Space AI Monday. I'm Andreas Hamberger. On the same day SpaceX filed for the largest initial public offering in recorded history, Artemis II launched from Kennedy Space Center. On 7th April, the crew set a new crewed lunar distance record at 252,021 miles from Earth, surpassing Apollo 13 by 3,366 miles. These two events are not coincidental. ESA demonstrated that crewed lunar operations are technically feasible. SpaceX simultaneously sought $75 billion to build the commercial layer underneath them. Government proves capability. Private capital prices it. The space mafia thesis has tracked this dynamic since episode 1. The corporate Kardashev mechanism describes exactly this. Private entities using capital concentration to move critical infrastructure progressively beyond the reach of terrestrial regulation. The SpaceX IPO is not a prediction of that trajectory. It is the mechanism made into a public market event. The financials require context. SpaceX reported approximately $15 to $16 billion in 2025 revenue, with adjusted profit of around $8 billion. But approximately 80% of that profit came from Starlink broadband. The current business is, in substantive terms, a broadband provider. The $75 billion raise is not optimizing that business. It is building the next layer, orbital data centers, xAI model hosting in the Starlink mesh, strategic control of the launch market, and Mars colonization infrastructure. The $2 trillion valuation prices optionality. It prices the world where SpaceX owns the orbital compute layer the way AWS owns the terrestrial cloud layer. The retail allocation is 30% of the total, approximately $22.5 billion. That is triple the industry standard. The IPO structure engineers patient capital-oriented to decade-horizon infrastructure. And the February 2026 SpaceX-xAI merger at a combined valuation of $1.25 trillion created the first entity simultaneously controlling AI model development, inference infrastructure, orbital connectivity across more than 10,000 satellites, launch capability, satellite manufacturing, and planned orbital data center deployment. No prior entity has held this stack. The Artemis II mission carried Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Henson, the first Canadian to travel to lunar distance. The technical objectives were met. Splashdown is scheduled for 10th of April. For the commercial space argument, Artemis II is proof of concept. It demonstrates that the destination SpaceX's IPO is financing are reachable. ESA spent decades and enormous public resource establishing that humans can survive lunar transit. SpaceX is raising $75 billion from public markets to make that transit routine and commercially governed. This series has used the pirate radio parallel since episode 4. In the 1960s, commercial broadcasters operated from ships in international waters beyond national jurisdiction until regulators were compelled to create new frameworks. The orbital governance contest is structurally analogous. Artemis establishes that governments retain the capacity for crewed deep space operations. The SpaceX IPO establishes that private capital intends to govern the infrastructure layer. What fills the space between them is the regulatory architecture that organizations like NZSA are now actively building. This is where the analysis lands for New Zealand readers. The Outer Space and High Altitude Activities Amendment Act 2025 came into force on 29 July 2025. It established a transitional authorization regime covering telemetry, tracking, and control of space objects, space surveillance and identification, and transfer of data to and from spacecraft, including geodetic infrastructure. Consumer satellite products and personal domestic activities are excluded. The transitional period ends at the earlier of Stage 2 regulations coming into force, or 29 July 2026. According to Denton's NZ, citing NZSA communication on 2nd April 2026, regulations are likely to come into force this month. Operators who are planning for a July compliance window should note the effective deadline has moved forward by approximately 3 months. Stage 2 requires formal GBSI activity authorization. Requirements include identifying security risks, establishing protective security arrangements, and customer due diligence, including verifying the identity and activities of infrastructure partners. That last requirement is structurally analogous to the beneficial ownership obligations in the Anti-Money Laundering Act. Penalties. Fines of up to $250,000 for entities and $50,000 for individuals, plus up to 1 year's imprisonment. Rocket Lab, headquartered in Auckland and listed on NASDAQ, reported 2025 revenue of approximately $602 million, up approximately 38% year-on-year, with 38% GAAP gross margins and a backlog of approximately $1.85 billion. $816 million missile warning satellite prime contract was announced in 2025. The Mynaric acquisition in early 2026, following German regulatory approval in March, established Rocket Lab Europe in Munich and provides laser optical communication capability for a LEO mesh network integration. The New Zealand space sector has grown 53% since 2019, contributing approximately 2.5 billion New Zealand dollars to the economy in 2023 to 2024. The XAI dimension adds a specific layer. StarCloud reached unicorn status in late March 2026 via a $170 million Series A at $1.1 billion valuation. First operational orbital AI inference was demonstrated in December 2025. When inference moves to orbital altitude, oversight becomes structurally more difficult, subject to the jurisdiction of the launch state under the Outer Space Treaty, not necessarily the jurisdiction of the data subject or the enterprise operating the query. The Heaven Skynet vector framework addresses this directly, a threat that will develop further in GenAI Tuesday. Several developments in the next 60 to 90 days will shape how this analysis develops. The public SpaceX S1 is expected in late April or early May 2026. The confidential filing was the first step. The public S1 will contain audited financials and risk disclosures that current pre-marketing estimates do not include. The revenue and profit figures cited in this episode are from Bloomberg, Reuters, and CNBC reporting on institutional pre-marketing communications. Verify against the public S1 when it lands. The GBSI Stage 2 regulations, if the April timing is confirmed, will be gazetted and enforceable. Organizations that have not begun their authorization applications should do so immediately. NZSIS has confirmed since July 2025 that New Zealand GBSI operators have received requests to develop infrastructure for entities concealing foreign military affiliations. The 5-country council, NSA, ASD, NCSC, NZ, CCCS, and GCHQ, co-authored a joint advisory on LEO SATCOM cybersecurity on 24 March 2026. NCSC-NZ's co-authorship reflects New Zealand's formal participation in the collective security framework for orbital infrastructure, operating at a separate layer from the domestic GBSI framework. SpaceX Monday next week addresses the US-China orbital bifurcation directly. The corporate Kardashev framework has tracked the Western commercial actor strategy across this series. Competing sovereign Kardashev trajectory, China's three-body constellation targeting 2,800 satellites and approximately 1 exaflop of orbital compute capacity, has not yet received primary treatment. It changes next Monday. The kernel that ran New Zealand's earliest internet infrastructure in 1994, the subject of the ongoing Linux Wednesday series, is now running in orbital edge compute platforms. That thread connects directly to the IPO-financed infrastructure layer, and this series will return to it. The question this episode leaves open is not whether SpaceX will list. It is what happens to the governance window when the infrastructure owner goes public and ownership distributes to millions of retail investors. Does distributed ownership make orbital infrastructure more accountable or less? If your organization operates ground-based infrastructure that communicates with satellites, what is your current understanding of where your GBSI obligations begin and end?
That is the Hamberger report for today. If this was useful, subscribe and hit the like button. It helps more professionals find the channel. You will find links to everything we covered in the description below. I am Andreas Hamberger, and I will see you tomorrow.
Like and subscribe.